And number 4 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest?
Is anybody saying anything? I'm sorry, I can't hear anything.
Me neither, Councillor Potter.
Testing, testing, testing. Everyone on team?
Sorry about this. Can anyone in the chamber hear me? Because I cannot hear anyone, any sounds at all from the chamber. Can anyone outside the chamber hear me?
I can hear you, Councillor Potter. It's Lee Henley.
I can hear you, Councillor Potter. It's Lisa Clamping from the Auditors.
Oh, thank you very much. It must be, we had this problem last week and I had to abort the meeting, but I hope we're going to be okay tonight.
Hope so, yeah. Fingers crossed.
I don't want to sound like Mr. Grumpy, but last night's meeting went on, I think, round about 40 minutes shy of midnight. We don't really want another repetition of that tonight, do we?
Hi, Councillor Potter, it's Jenny.
Hello, Jenny, I can hear you.
That's because I'm sitting in my kitchen.
I can hear you, Jen. It's Lee. I can hear you loud and clear this end.
Oh, Jenny, put the kettle on.
I think there's an issue in the chambers, so just bear with us.
Okie dokie.
I'll let you know as soon as I know.
So did this happen last night then, Jenny? Was it a similar problem?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did actually hear something from the chambers for a split second, about
Yes.
5 or 10 seconds.
I think she said testing. So they're obviously still testing, I think. I think it's because they're switching between the chamber and MST. But I'll keep you up to date as soon as I hear. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
Testing, testing. Anyone on Teams? Hear me? Hear me?
Hi, Lucy. We can hear you. Testing, testing.
Can hear.
Lee, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jake. Yeah, I can hear you.
What was that, Lee? Sorry?
Yeah, Jake, I can hear you. It's Lee.
Lee, can you hear me? It's Lucy.
Hi, Luce. Can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Lee.
Fantastic.
I think we're ready if we're going to get started. Councillor Potter, you can all hear? Just one last double check.
Yeah, I can hear.
Right. So we'll get Lee to present the this item.
Thank you, Chair. So this is our annual information governance report. It covers three main areas: data protection, records management, and freedom of information. I'll summarise the report, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So in terms of FOI, similar volumes to the previous year, 1,042 requests received. Appendix 1 of the report, page 19, provides the detail in relation to FOI, so it gives details on exemptions and key themes. In terms of performance, really good year in terms of performance. 97% of those requests were processed within the legal timeframe, an improvement on last year of 95%. It's also worth noting that the Information Commissioner's Office expect performance in the region of 90%, so it's really positive performance. And also worth noting is that since 2014-15, FOI requests have doubled, but our performance has remained strong. In terms of data protection, what the reporting period is showing is that 132 subject access requests were received. So these are requests under the Act whereby individuals can ask the Council for copies of information we hold on them, and 97% of those requests were processed within time frame. There's been a massive increase in numbers, and that is in the main due to the removal of the £10 fee that we can charge for subject access requests when the General Data Protection Regulation is brought in. General Data Protection compliance is summarised within Appendix 2 on pages 23 and 24, and you know, we're a council that are certainly going in the right direction in terms of data protection compliance. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions?
I do have a question actually. Sorry, just working the microphone. On the with regards to the 9,764 boxes, is the nature of that information contained in those boxes of a nature it would be non-compliant with GDPR if they were to be retained, and if so, is there a plan to identify the records that need to be destroyed?
Yes, so that's a key reason why we need to review those boxes, and for those records that are in retention, they would remain to be stored, but any records that exceed our retention timeframes would need to be disposed of. That's a key part of the project.
Yeah,
No, Lee. The council received 3 complaints from the Information Commissioner's Office regarding the management of Sars. Can you just explain what form they take and what we have to do with them, please?
Lee, your mic's muted.
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. In terms of the SAR complaints, one complaint was in relation to when the council responded to the SAR, we withheld information and the complaint was then made. My team then arranged with a meeting with the individual to discuss the non-disclosure complaint, but the individual failed to turn up, so that matter was closed. We responded to the ICO. The other two complaints were purely in relation to because we missed a deadline as a council to respond to the SAR. But overall, our performance is good, so and that can be reflected by the 97% response within time frame.
Anyone else have any questions? Councillor Spillman.
Not a question, just some warm words, really, to be honest. I think, again, Lee, you're keeping a tight ship. I've got nothing but praise for the way you've dealt with members' inquiries over the years. Just keep up the good work. These figures are to be commended. I always think your team achieve above expectation, and sometimes even though they're probably below what any you would prefer as a workforce, but every manager wants more staff, obviously. But no, keep up the good work, and thanks for your continuing fine efforts, Lee.
Thank you very much.
Here.
Lee, on page 19, we talk about the freedom of information status: supplied, refused, cancelled, and classified. Can you just tell us how you come to a decision on refusing a request?
It depends what the request is in relation to. So there are a number of exemptions within the legislation that where a refusal can be made. So, for example, if disclosure would disclose financial information in relation to a third party, so we would apply a commercial interest exemption. Or if the request was detailed and would take the council more than 18 hours to respond to that request, we can simply refuse that request on cost grounds. Or another reason is if the council have already made that information public, so we would refuse because it's already in the public domain. So it does depend on the nature of the request. Another example is, if we were to respond or disclose information, it would compromise someone else's personal data, so that would be a data protection exemption. So we apply all those tests before we respond.
Thank you. Any further questions? I'll take that as no. So we'll move on to item 6. Lee, if you could introduce that for us.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a regular item at committee, and this particular report is our annual RIPA report, which summarises RIPA activity for 1920, but also provides a refreshed RIPA policy. RIPA activity is detailed on page 28 within para 3.1.1. Activity volumes are low, and the RIPA policy changes. There are no major changes that have been made to the policy, and they're summarised on pages 28 and 29 in para 3.2.1. Happy to take any questions.
Lee, when it comes to fraud, can you just tell us, not specifics, but what the nature of that would be?
I can again, fraud, it could be, RIPA request, this is in RIPA in the main is in relation, it covers covert surveillance. So that could be a request to do surveillance in relation to fraud, any fraud activity, or it could be also RIPA's primarily used at Thurrock for some trading standards investigations as well. So underage sales, counterfeit goods. So it's any any mechanism where the council need to undertake an element of covert surveillance. It's a last resort, and as a council, we've got a responsibility to make sure we use less intrusive means, but it's covert surveillance, last resort.
The reason I asked that question is there was a joint operation between the police and Thurrock Council at a compound behind the Dorset Golf Club in the last 2 weeks. And I was just curious of how we'd have actually reported that.
Yeah, sorry, Chad, I don't know the details of that particular case, but RIPA only applies when we have to seek RIPA approval from the courts. If we want, as a council, we want to undertake any covert surveillance. I know that our fraud team have done joint work with the police, and in the past they've jumped off the back of some police RIP authorisations, but maybe Sean, or if maybe Kleinberg's there, they could possibly provide some more detail on that.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, Lee's correct. RIPA activity and surveillance is last resort. It has to be that we can't get the material by any other means. If we do joint operations, I'm not saying that one in particular, but any joint operations with the police, depending on who's leading, will be the responsible agency to get that RIPA. So it may be, in certain circumstances, that's Essex Police, and we follow their lead on the lead agency.
Are there any further questions? If there are none, then we have recommendations on page 27. Are those agreed? Agreed. Right. And we'll move on to item 7, which is the Chief Internal Auditor's Annual Report. And that's going to be given to us by Gary Clifford.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
So this is the annual report which I'm required to present each year, giving my opinion on the governance, risk management and internal control frameworks. We always like to say it should be noted that assurances can never be absolute. You can only provide reasonable assurance based on the work that we've undertaken. In para 3 on page 57, we make a reference to the coronavirus pandemic as well. It has had an impact on the work we've been doing between March and July, which is when we tend to be mopping up all of our end-of-year reports and finalising them. But I've taken that into account in coming to my opinion. We're asking the committee to consider and comment on the report. 3.1 on page 58. We issued 12 assurance reports, all of which were positive. We've also issued 7 advisory reports, undertook 4 whistleblowing investigations and reviewed the processes and procedures around a major procurement exercise. Towards the end of the year, we were also asked to look at some major highways projects where issues were identified around the contract management and controls. 3.2, page 58, this paragraph relates to the governance framework. We did look at the register of hospitality gifts and members' allowances. Both received green opinions. However, due to the issues around the governance of those major highways projects, I gave an overall opinion of amber. That opinion was green the previous year. Paragraph 3.3 on page 59, risk management is still robust and in line with the corporate insurance and risk manager's self-assessment as reported to the committee in March 20 and remains at green. And 3.4, the internal control was also given an amber assurance rating due to the issues around those highways projects. Appendix 1 on page 65. The Chief Internal Auditor's report informs the annual governance statement, which forms part of the final accounts process. On pages 66 and 67, we provide a bit more detail around how the opinions have been given and the ratings that they got. Page 68, all recommendations were agreed with management at the debrief stage. We also report progress on implementing recommendations on page 68, and overall that's been good. Of the 8 recommendations outstanding, the 1 high and the 4 medium are all on there still as outstanding because they just haven't reached the dates that they needed to be implemented by. Number 5 on page 69, that gives more detail of the other work we've carried out within the service. We can say also there were no conflicts of interest on any of the work that we undertook. And on page 70, in respect of compliance with the public sector internal audit standards, the service is looking to restructure to meet the increased demands and priorities and the retirement of a senior member of the team. Once this has been completed, we'll undertake the internal self-assessment and then get an external assessment carried out. Page 71 is just a table of key performance indicators, and then 72 through to 74, sorry. That's the opinion recommendations for the reports issued in 1920, so happy to take any questions.
I just have one particular question to start with. On page 67, when it talks about risk management, could you explain to the committee what that actually means and how you operate that?
In terms of how we use it to inform our audit process, it'll probably come out within the next report on the planning, the audit plan and the strategy. But we actually hold discussions with senior managers to determine their levels of risk. We look at the risk register and we discuss it with the Insurance Risk Management Officer, Andy Owen. He regularly presents here, so members get a level of confidence about the way that risk management's operating. We also look at the self-assessment that he carries out just to see if we fall in line in terms of where we think risk is with his opinion as well.
Are there any questions on this report? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just quickly explain the difference between an assurance report and an advisory report, please?
Yes, certainly. With an assurance report, we tend to be looking at a system and working our way through that system and then providing management with assurance around the controls and the risk management and the governance around that system. With an advisory report, they are quite often driven by the service who identify a problem and then ask us to go in. So they already know that there's an issue there, and so it's not assurance they need, it's advice in how they can tighten up their controls and their risk management.
Thanks, Gary. So just for my clearance, an advisory is somewhere where you're asked to look into it. The assurance reports, so did you just pick them out of the air, or are they something that you set that you do every year? Or
the assurance reports, the majority of our audit plan is made up of the assurance reports.
And on page 72, you talk about internal audit opinion and recommendations. I was just intrigued to look at footway crossings to review the application, commissioning and inspection process to ensure basically that residents are getting value for money and the council, etc. How do you actually engage on that? You know, you just go out to a couple of these and look at them and the process that's been followed?
We will go out and look at some of the footway crossings. We also look at all the documentation that sits behind them, from the application right through to the final agreement. And we will also look at things like comparisons with other local authorities in terms of charges and that sort of thing.
Councillor Spillman.
What was the actual performance for management responses received within 10 days in the last audit report? Because this year there says there's been slippage, and you're regularly, just page 71, you're regularly having to regularly chase management to provide the information that you were requesting. Is that? I mean, you do mention the audit being slightly derailed by the pandemic. But has that been a historical problem, or is that just a one-off that we've got here?
It is a little bit of a historic problem that we have, yeah.
Why is that? Because who sets that target of 80%? I mean, what's the rationale behind that 10 days?
10 da's tends to be pretty standard format, but we've also got the audit protocol that's agreed by members and goes through Directors' Board that gives the 10 days as the deadline. So it has been agreed.
I mean, I'm wondering why management aren't providing you the details for these reports within a set amount of time, and I'm wondering what I as a member and what we as members should be doing to make sure that this happens in the future, because 60% isn't a particularly fantastic performance by management. So what teeth do you have to make sure that this happens, or is it just a case of just nagging relentlessly?
We do have the audit protocol. We don't use it as much as we should, and we use the escalation processes that are within that protocol, and that's something we definitely will be doing moving forward.
Are there any further questions? That being the case, we have recommendation on page 57. Is that agreed? Right, thank you. We move on to item 8. I think, Gary, you're going to introduce this one as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is our internal audit strategy 2021 to 22 to 23, an annual plan for 2021. Between December 19 and March 20, we carried out a comprehensive audit needs assessment. Due to the timing of the plan, the implications of the pandemic haven't been reflected in it. However, it's already clear that this is going to have implications for the plan as we move forward. Changes in working practices and, in some cases, the roles that people are carrying out. So during this current year, we'll be constantly reviewing the plan to ensure the service is utilising its resources to best meet the needs of the council. In terms of 2.1 on page 75 and 76, we provide details there of all those staff and teams that we met with as part of the A&A process. You can see there's quite a lot of... my mic keeps going on. We also have to consider other sources of information when we're planning the process. So we look at things like the external auditor's annual audit and inspection letters, the AGS, the annual governance report, etc., the risk and opportunity register. And we also pick up on any new and emerging issues to consider those as well in terms of the plan. Any changes to the plan will be agreed with either myself and or Sean and reported to members of the committee as part of the progress reports as and when they occur. Point 3.1 on page 77, we did set an ambitious plan. the pandemic and the unexpected retirement of one of the senior auditors will have an impact on our resources. That's already been identified by myself working with Sean, and he's put budgets in place, but under the current climate, actually recruiting is going to take longer than it would ordinarily. Page 77, 4.1. We're asking standards and audit committee members to satisfy themselves that the strategy covers the key risks of the council. The plan reflects the areas the committee believe are a priority and recognise the additional flexibility required to address the issues arising from the pandemic. Sufficient assurances are being received. We then go to Appendix 1, page 81, 1.1. There's a bit there about the role of internal audit and how we plan and perform our work. Page 81, 1.2. Just a bit more there about the fact that last year was the third year of the previous strategy, so we had to undertake an ANA in the current year. We also commissioned a specific IT ANA to be undertaken by Sars, who provide our specialist IT audit work through a framework agreement. Page 82, the draft plan was circulated to members of DB for comment, and page 84, there's the considerations there for the Standards and Audit Committee. Page 85, Appendix A, that's sort of the external and internal factors that we look at as part of our planning process. And then pages 86 to 96 is the 3-year strategy, and 97 to 103 is the annual plan for 2020-21 with the proposed timings. So happy to take any questions.
Councillor Smilman.
Yeah, only one quick question. I note that when I was reading through this, I was noting that COVID isn't one of your external factors on Appendix A. Would that just include that's just in public health, yeah? That just sits within there. Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's where I actually slipped in, because this was done before the pandemic actually hit.
I just had a couple of questions. Page 85, it talks about the issues affecting Thurrock Council. Obviously, we know about COVID-19. We know you're doing the utmost to protect the council in that manner. But there's an item here that talks about major projects. I can appreciate we're going to talk about one or two later on. But can you tell us what that really includes when you talk about emerging?
Again, that is as a result of the work that we carried out towards the end of the year. So it is what is going to be discussed a bit later on. So that's why I put that in there. I think it's emerging in terms of the fact, again, when I was actually pulling this together, we didn't know exactly the specific details of what was happening. We'd had some meetings with senior management, but hadn't got that much involved at that stage. But you'll see from the actual annual plan that there is stuff in there around major projects now.
The other item that you talk about, the emerging item that will come through, is on the top of this, is Brexit. Can you tell us what will affect the council in that manner?
That is emerging because we don't actually know at this stage.
I just say it's not a trick question. It's just asking the, what you feel that could affect the council.
Hi, Chair. I guess there are a number of issues, and Gary's right to put it on here to pick up issues as they arise. But not knowing what deal there may or may not be in by the 31st of December, will have impacts on our trading standards teams, for instance. If there are going to be issues around the ports, around traffic, for instance, etc., what we might have to do around supporting that, what could come through. You can pretty well look across the authority and recognise that there could be an impact. We just don't know yet. So we'll certainly have it in here as a flag to be able to react where necessary.
Are there any further questions? Yes.
In the auditable areas that are expecting to be looked at in 3 years concurrently, are they areas that you know to be inherently higher risk, or are they areas that have had issues in the past?
In terms of the plan, you're looking at 22, 23. Some of them will have been ones that have rolled forward. So just an example, gas safety, electrical safety, we would look at them every couple of years anyway. But it tends to be through the discussions that we have with the service managers and the service directors, when they're looking to the future, these are the areas that we may need to pick up on.
No further questions? Okay. There is a recommendation on page 75. Is that agreed? Right, thank you. We move on to item 9, which is counter fraud and investigation. Right. David? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is the annual report and strategy for the next year for the counter fraud and investigation function. The first part looks back over the last year in the annual reports and the performance of the team during that period. Your notes on page 106, the team have detected £3.5 million of fraud across all the different top 10 risks that the council faces. That's resulted in 80 sanctions, and those sanctions are made up of prosecutions or other court activity. The proceeds of crime activity to take back the money that fraudsters may have taken from public funds stands at 205k for this year. You'll note in Appendix 1 that's down on the year before, and the impact of that is because of case proceedings that have been put back into the next financial year. So where we'd normally realise monies in year, that's been pushed back to this year that we're in now. So we're hoping this year will be an increase significantly, which takes account of the money lost for the last year. In terms of the outward activity, so obviously we have an outward-facing NATIS or National Investigation Service function the council hosts. We receive income for that, which pays for us doing activity for other councils or government departments. We've so far, since 2015, supported 60 other local authorities around the country that needed additional resilience or specialist capabilities that we have here in Thurrock. Appendix 2 is the forward-facing look for the service. So this is our strategy for this year. That's on page 125 to 132. Page 129, members of the committee will note the specific areas that we're focusing on this year. The obvious one being COVID and the impact of COVID. Thurrock, like all the councils in the country, have had to change what they do for the public. We've actually started to give money out for our revenues team, for example, as a stimulus grant to local businesses. So we've identified that as an inherent risk to the council, and this year we'll be focusing on doing some post-assurance activity in partnership with Internal Audit, where there may have been fraudulent applications for those stimulus schemes. The core focus really of the strategy for this year is around prevention. So trying to stop it at the door rather than chasing it out the door. We've engaged with the Cabinet Office new government counter fraud profession this year, and they've developed a number of tools and suites of activity that we can draw down upon and lay over Thurrock's system of internal control which looks at things like data analytics. So that's where we look at all the different systems we have in the council and try to identify the risks early on and then mitigate those with some form of proactive work with either internal audit or our own counter-fraud specialists. And that's the strategy for this year. I'm, of course, happy to take any questions.
Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the report, it's good that the team is helping out. The full team has got helping other authorities in place. But what I was just sort of wanted assurances of is, are we still in a position that we're not overstretching, so that if something comes up here, we're not going to end up committing ourselves too much elsewhere, and something could get under the radar here that we've not picked up because we've been overstretched, especially in light of COVID and the extra pressures that puts on the whole of the services that the council run.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Obviously, our main function and role here is to protect Thurrock. That's our first and primary function. We've always made sure that we're resourced accordingly. By having the expanded team that's funded by third parties, it means that we have that resilience. So if we do lose our own resources because of a major operation here that we're helping the council with, we have that resilience built into that. If we do get to the point where we don't have the resources, we simply won't do the work unless we're confident we can backfill. But that's done in advance rather than retrospectively. So we're a daily meeting with all the management team to make sure that we've got the appropriate resources, and obviously we don't overcommit ourselves to do stuff without taking thorough account first.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. David, good report overall, really good reading. But should we find any fraud on the COVID-19 business grants, is it down to us to try and get that back? Or does the government take over and do that? And if so, are we at any risk of the government asking us for that money back?
Well, since the COVID incident started, Sean and I have been on different groups with the Department for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, and also the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Government. They've provided assurance that obviously as long as we haven't just given money out willy-nilly, which of course we haven't, we've designed appropriate systems at Thurrock, in some respects over and above other authorities, then they'll underwrite that money if it has gone out the door because of fraud. But we're confident with the extra systems that we put in place that it should be quite a low level, if any at all, at Thurrock.
David, on page 105, where you talk about last year the team detected £3.5 million worth of fraud, can you just give us a flavour of what that actually means and which departments you actually picked it up on?
Yeah, of course. The main fraud typology we have at Thurrock is around housing tenancy fraud. That's mostly around unlawful subletting or unlawful claims for social housing when someone actually wasn't entitled to that property. The way that figure is calculated is part of a national figure. So, for example, a two-bedroom property would probably house a 3-4 member family. The council would have to pay out elsewhere for temporary accommodation, and that cost is then offset against the loss for Thurrock Council. So each property we recover, of which on page 117, as an example of Appendix 1, we've recovered 36 properties. So each property we recover on average is £23,000 worth of loss to the council. And again, through Appendix 1, you'll notice the other activity we've done in the different fraud typologies, and how we obviously work to recover that money where we do identify it.
Are there any further questions? Yes.
Just, I know that all the courts are shut, obviously, and all cases, you know, even criminal, a lot of criminal cases have been pushed back and back and back and back. So I realise that the money recovered figure doesn't really mean anything at the moment, but I mean, as someone who knows the numbers, what would you given on the sample you've got, is there any sort of projection you can make about when everything comes into line, what the figure for this year is going to be? Is there any sort of projection or estimate? Are we looking at a similar figure to last year, or are you hoping for a lot more, or are there concerns that it's going to be a lot lower?
I'd probably suggest it's going to be lower this year. If we take that example of housing tenancy fraud, because of the lockdown, most people didn't go and sublet their property. They stayed back in their premises. But again, we didn't have the opportunity to go out and knock on those doors because we were in the same situation as the rest of the borough and the country. But again, because people have been remaining at home, if you look at general crime, it's down to about a third overall, and that includes fraud, which is normally a 50% amount for crime in the UK generally. So I'll probably see a reduction this year, which is a positive thing. But again, until we start getting into the data and start liaising with our partners in policing and government, we're just not going to know at this point.
Well, it is very encouraging to see that you're actually picking up so much. For every £1 spent on the service, you detect £3 in fraud, which is very encouraging, and I'm sure the committee would want to pass their thanks on to you for that. With that in view, we have recommendations on page 105. Are those agreed? Agreed, thank you. And we move on to item 10, the investment briefing. Sean, you're going to present this one?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Members will have seen quite a bit in the press in recent times, and there was obviously a report that was debated at full council yesterday about the council's borrowing levels and its investment approach. This report basically sets out the headlines in terms of the questions you asked, Chair, about how much had actually been invested, being clear around the borrowing levels, and how safe are the investments. One thing I'd like to say right at the beginning, though, is quite a lot of the conversation has also been around the democratic oversight. Yeah, and so it was agreed, well, it was put forward by Corporate Overview and Scrutiny in January for Cabinet to actually consider improving that oversight. Cabinet agreed that in February, and then that was reinforced again last night within both the debate on investments and in Councillor Hebb's portfolio holder report. And I know that he's going to be writing to the leaders of the various groups over the next few days to set up that first meeting. And at that meeting, we will put forward some options around the future scrutiny of those investments, the members to be included within that, within those briefings as well, what we can actually do publicly, but also receive a full briefing on where we are now, which is the detail behind these numbers. So I know Councillor Hebb is doing that in the next few days, and hopefully we'll be able to get that meeting date in the diary. The report starts off with some background as to why we've been doing investments. This council has got one of the lowest council taxes for unitary authorities in the country. By definition, that gives it one of its lowest budgets. But yet we have the full range of services of any unitary authority, and proximity to London gives further challenges around costs and so on. So it's quite difficult to actually see where you can make significant savings in expenditure, but equally that means you need to look towards income. So without actually going through it in detail, the first few paragraphs, 2.1 onwards, gives a background about how we started in investments going back. One of the other key points that's been raised is the fact that we use interlocal authority borrowing. For councillors here and for our co-opted member, long-term borrowing is usually done through what's called the Public Works Loan Board. That is a sort of government quango, if you like, where local authorities traditionally go to borrow for medium to long term. But ever since local authorities have existed, there has been an interlocal authority borrowing market, normally for shorter terms. The report sets out that back in 2010, the council carried out a significant debt restructuring of the PWLB, where we were paying more than 6% on all of our debt at the time. We repaid that, but for accounting purposes, we actually needed to cover that for a period through short-term borrowing through other local authorities. But then the difference was stark. We found that we were actually out there borrowing at the time at sort of 0.5%. And this was at the time of financial challenges throughout the country. The money is a £12 billion market in terms of interlocal authorities, so there is plenty of supply there. And we actually just carried on with the shorter term borrowing approach because it was more beneficial to us financially. And as was pointed out last night, it's actually financially beneficial as well to the other local authorities that lend it. So when we come back to the table, that's at 2.8. We're breaking down our borrowings and at a very high level, the line in there for investments at the 31st of March. At the 31st of March, we owed £1.4 billion. Now, whilst that is high in anybody's language, in local authorities, there are certainly other authorities up and around that level, but the majority of their borrowing, and higher, but the majority of their borrowing was done through PWLB. The attention was on Thurrock Council because of the amount that was short-term borrowing on this. And I've already touched on one reason for that, but I'll continue to do so as well. There is an additional £100 million that we took, so that is already £100 million higher than it would normally be. And that's because moving into the new financial year with COVID, knowing that we weren't going to be being able to collect as much council tax and business rates going forward, mainly because of deferrals, partly because of real losses, but mainly deferrals that we knew we needed to bolster our cash flow. And as an example, in the first 3 months of this year, we've collected £31 million less in cash than we did this time last year. And that sort of demonstrates the need to have increased our cash flow ability. But on the bottom half of that table, I've then taken off that 100 million because over time that is repayable. It should only be a temporary measure of needing that as we then collect more and catch up on the collection of those particular collections. But we then see that we've got £985 million in various different investments. They're through bonds and the churches, charities and local authority property fund, as well as a number of other smaller ones. What that means, whereas the headline has certainly been borrowing of over £1 billion, or in this case £1.4 billion, 1.1 billion of that is actually going to be repayable. When the bonds come to an end, when we repay the £100 million back, and that is on a 2-year deal, paying back 25% every 6 months, it means that our actual net debt position is 331 million. Which obviously far lower. 2.10 gives a high level breakdown of how that money has been invested in terms of categories. So the renewable energy sector, that is not just solar, it's wind farms, it's biomass and others. The CCLA property fund that I just mentioned, and other, including TRL. And sorry for Lisa for your information, in case you don't know, TRL, Thurrock Regeneration Limited, it's the council's housing regeneration company that the council also lends to. Okay. There has been nationally considerable concern from government departments and others about investments for a fair while now. But that has certainly been highlighted in the COVID, as an impact of COVID now. But the majority of those, and this was shown within the National Audit Office report, which I think was February, were around the actual ownership of property. You've got the debt, you've got the property, you haven't got that repayment mechanism, and you were relying on people going into shopping centres, being able to pay their rents to the shops and so on. Including airports. So Luton Council and Southend Council, for instance, both have interest in airports, and of course they've been impacted as well. The council, though, took a view that it wasn't going to go in for actual property, and looked at the various opportunities that came through, and renewable energy was by far a stronger one for us. in terms of basically international drive, for renewable energy and government support for it. So that we've seen now through the COVID has not been impacted at all. Obviously, the sun's still shining, the wind's still blowing, and people are still using electricity and power. So we have seen no losses and suffered no losses from COVID on any of the investments. Investments, by their nature, though, are at risk. We appreciate that. So again, not only having considered the type of investments we were going into and looking at the overall risk, we consider renewable energy lower, but within 2.15, paragraph 2.15, there is a list of things which we know are in place, which give us more confidence and gave us confidence from the outset. This was all part of due diligence, and we did use industry experts on our due diligence as well. And we do have charges similar to a mortgage over each of the sites as well. So that gives us further security against this. I think, Chair, quite a lot has been said about investments in recent days. I will stop there, but obviously happy to take any questions.
Councillor Spillman. Well, take one at a time, and we'll go.
They're quite short price.
So have one.
So what's the average term of the loans that we've taken out, these short-term loans? What are we talking about?
Thank you, Councillor Smillman. They all range between 3 and 7 years now, or well, actually 1. So when we took the loans out, when we took the bonds out, sorry, you're talking about the investment terms or our borrowing terms? Oh, from other councils, sorry. They could be ranging anywhere between a week and a year. We've got a couple which go into 2 years.
Bonds, when do the bonds mature?
When we took the bonds out, there were a mixture of between 3 and 5 years. Some we've renegotiated the 5-year ones into 10 years, but we're 2 to 3 years within that cycle now. The thing with bonds, and I have set that out in the report, and it's another reason. So part of the questions I've been asked by other 151 officers and others, well, if you've got a 10-year bond, why aren't you taking out 10-year borrowing for certainty? The issue with the bonds is that we can sell them on, but we can't actually ask for them to be redeemed. But the person that we're investing with could redeem tomorrow. And my answer has always been, well, if I've got a 10-year loan now, especially for such significant money, and then somebody actually pays us all of that investment within 2 to 3 years, then actually we're going to be left with that loan for the remaining period. So again, partly due to the improved rates, but partly as well managing that risk has been why we've stayed taking that approach.
How much have we spent on the bonds, and what do you estimate the market value of those bonds to be at the moment? And if you wanted to sell those bonds today, say you needed to, how easy would it be to sell those bonds?
The bonds, because the bonds are all at par, the bonds are worth exactly what we lent out. They don't fluctuate from that. If we know that a number of the sites, as they've had planning permission extended and so on, have therefore increased in all of their value, which gives us more security. But equally, that amount stays in terms of the amount we've lent through. Because of that, it's also really difficult to say how much we could sell those bonds for. It depends on what other purchasers would be looking for. Do they want long-term gains? Do they want short-term gains, and so on? So it would really depend. We're not looking to do that. I must admit, I haven't done the research on that.
In terms of the loans that we've taken from other councils, can those loans be called in immediately by local councils who are distressed, or is there set times where they will be paid back and there's no way that can be called in any quicker? And are you concerned, because obviously you're refinancing all the time to pay off loans, are you concerned that that supply of loans, with the amount of distressed councils that there might be, is going to dry up and leave us in any difficulty?
No, anybody that has lent us the money is not able to call back the loan. If they were distressed and they asked us to, there's nothing stopping anybody with asking, then it would be our decision, but it can't be enforced back. In terms of funding drying up, we're still managing to borrow. A number of authorities are holding back cash for the same reason as we borrowed more at the beginning, because of the uncertainties over COVID. But equally, we know that we can go to PWLB as the last resort should we need to. So that's always been the ability that, should we not be able to borrow, that's the approach we could take. At this point, we are not planning to, but should we need to, we can.
In terms of where we are now, I'd just like to, I mean, obviously when you did your risk assessment, did your due diligence, this would have been placed as, you know, the council took the view that this was low risk. Now, obviously that's in the pre-COVID world. Now, where we are now, if you'd been doing, I mean, would you still be doing this deal post-COVID, I suppose? What are the risks now? Would 3% on the return have been, would it have been a bit higher now due to, we've been asking for more due to the risks? And what are the risks of these bonds not being paid back?
At this time, we're obviously in discussions with all of the people that we have investments with. Would we still do them? In terms, I've no reason to say no. Not for the reasons of COVID, certainly. You know, when we've looked through this, all of the assets are still performing as they're meant to. We're still getting the regular reports demonstrating that. We're still receiving the income through on a regular basis. So these are not affected. And that's what I pointed out earlier about the difference between, say, renewable energy in this case and some areas like retail parks and the like. Sorry, what's the second half of the question?
Sorry. What are the main risks that you're looking at the present time? What are your main concerns? Because I know it's low risk, but within that low risk, what are your main concerns with where we are at the moment?
Main concerns would go back in part to a question you asked a few minutes ago, which is about funding. If more and more councils were not lending due to COVID and due to distress, but having said that, we've got the mitigation in through going through PWLB should we need to. Looking at the various different solar farms and wind farms, again, we're not seeing any reductions in performance. We're not seeing any reductions in price there. Government intervention can always be a risk, but actually government at the moment are doing more to promote renewable. So at this stage, I've not seen anything which has come across my desk in terms of various different reports that are suggesting any more risks than there had been originally, and they've been low from the outset.
Councillor Ken.
Thank you, Chair. I think I only really got one question. It's I do find the figures sort of, it's a large amount of money that we're borrowing and that we've got. I'm just concerned that is there a time that government would come and say that because in light of where we are globally, with Brexit, potentially the end of the year, with COVID-19, everything sort of, we didn't think we'd be where we were a few months ago, to the beginning of this year or the end of last year. Would the government ever come down and say that you are, as an authority, we are borrowing too much, taking too much risk in light of the size of the authority and the income we get coming in? Would that be a factor that the government could turn around and say that, or if other councils do have to call on the government for help and we owe them money, could that, what would happen then? What would the scenario be then?
I just don't see that happening. If we look around at the various things that have happened, we can look at Northamptonshire, where a Section 114 notice was served. That created some delays in repaying some of their money back to other councils, for instance. But all of that funding was paid back, so nobody lost through that type of distress on an authority. The government is certainly looking at whether councils should be doing investments at the moment. Myself and other colleagues have been on calls with the Treasury over the last 2 weeks around the PWLB consultation. And that is being designed to stop PWLB being used for investments in the future. But what they've been clear about, and we've asked the questions directly, is that actually anything that's happened historically and the ability to refinance and so on would not be affected by that. Now, that's the government's lending arm, if you like, that is actually supporting that. So the government would have more difficulties, I think, if they came out to local authorities and tried to ask them to unravel investments that they've been through. So it would be more a case of, I think, through either legislation and through controlling the PWLB, of saying, actually, no more. We're going to make it more difficult now, or we're going to stop it going forward. But they wouldn't be able to affect the past.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sean. I haven't really got a question, as Councillor Spillman really took most of them on board, but my major one would have been around if there was any major change in the risk post-COVID, which you answered. But really it's just to try and make clear, we have the mitigation with PWLB. The income from our investments has not been affected. It's still coming in. And in actual fact, our net debt is only £331 million. And also, I can't see any government coming in telling you to unravel debt, which might put you in the wrong position. I just can't see that happening. Do you agree with that?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think what we have to be clear about is that we've done nothing wrong. And there are us and a number of other councils that have been doing this. I think the other point, and I can't remember whether I've actually put it in this report, is that councils have been doing this for a century. You know, the lending has always taken place, building industrial units, for instance, you know, as a way of making money through income streams, has always happened. So it's just the level that people have gone to now over the last decade has ramped up, and that's what's got the attention. So it was acceptable, not so acceptable now, but it's always we've not done anything which we are not allowed to do, shall we say. It's within legislation to be able to do what we've done. So it need a change of that to actually affect things going forward. But you can't you can't rewrite history like that.
Yes.
I just have a question about the property funds, actually. So, given the occasional illiquid nature of these funds and sort of prevalence of dating in that sector, would you have any concerns that it would put you into difficulty if you weren't able to access the money when you needed to? And what was the sort of thought process behind selecting a property fund as opposed to a kind of more balanced equities fund to sit alongside bonds?
Yeah,
Thank you for the questions. The property fund, by going into it, is actually already quite balanced. So rather than going into property individually, mention about retail parks, for instance, or shopping centres and the like, the CCLA property fund has been around an awful long time now. It's gone through 2 property crashes before we actually put any funding into it ourselves. It's very, very diverse in terms of the types of properties it's got all around the UK as well. And the history of it, where you've seen one of the property crashes, has consistently had a bump, if you like, in terms of the capital value, which is always more than bounce back, but the steady income streams being met throughout the period of that as well. So there was no reductions in income flows, from that process. So that was the reason for going in for that. It created diversity in the property market and so on. That one isn't so liquid, and I think I comment on that in the report. So it's never been a case of we believe that we're actually going to get that back in 3 years. We're not planning for that. We're not planning to take that funding out at all. So the liquidity side of that is not something which concerns us.
Sean, obviously the reason for the report, not just the Financial Times report, the reason is obviously the big numbers. Local residents, they see paper headlines, 1.2 billion, they get very concerned. And the other thing that they probably don't understand is that we get 30 million in. Now, can you tell us the interest payments on this? We were told, I think, last night, they were £1 million per month. Now, is that 30 million net, or is it 30 million less to 12 million? Because it's this type of questioning, and I am glad to see that the council last night actually agreed that we should have an investment committee of some description so that members have a chance to actually ask questions and everything's out in the open. And because then you publish these minutes, it means that the members of the public that are joining us this evening will actually have insight into what we're actually doing. And I think those are the main reasons that I actually called for this, and obviously to make sure that the money was sound. So perhaps you could just touch on those couple of points.
Certainly, Chair, thank you. So last year, looking at the investment position, the net position, so that was after any fees, within CCLA, that does attract fees as well, management fees. The council cleared £35 million. So that was after all expenses. I should have picked up on something that Councillor Spillman said earlier when he mentioned 3%. The returns are, but there's very much a variety and range depending on the nature. I think one thing to say is even with a higher rate than 3%, we can still look and say, actually, shouldn't you be getting more? But actually, I think we also know that the higher rates you're getting are normally because the investment themselves is more risky, and that again is reflected.
And one of the reasons why we asked for this report, I've got a long memory, and I can remember BCCI, also the Icelandic banks, which many local authorities, I'm glad to say that we weren't one of them, took advantage of this extra percent and exposed themselves to a vast problem. And of course, what happened thereon was that the council taxpayer was burdened with this collapse, if you like, which happened in those two instances. It's not underwritten by the government. It falls solely on the local authority. So it's a charge to the taxpayer for a long time. And I think those are the type of fears. The residents I've spoke to just wanted to be assured that, for want of a nicer word, we weren't playing Russian roulette with public money. That might sound very colourful, but that's the assurance, really, what we seek tonight, that the investments are sound and that we are receiving the income, which you've talked about this evening, which is good, because we all understand through COVID-19, and obviously this council will face challenges through COVID-19, and obviously when we talk about the next agenda item, there'll be further challenges in there. But it's that reassurance that you can give this evening to the public out there. It's not just meant for us in here, and if you can give that, I think we're going some way to reassure people.
I guess I'd hope I've done quite a lot of that tonight. I think actually Lisa mentioned going into equities. Again, equities have got their own risks depending on the nature you're going for and so on, but equally have little security behind them. So if I go back to something I said at the beginning, we've gone for in the main, we've gone for an area in terms of renewable that we know there is a longer term future for. There is considerable government subsidy within these contracted. The investments in terms of solar certainly have got a lot of forward buyers. One of the main is HSBC Bank for 20 years to purchase all of that on interest on inflation-based increases and so on as well. So the end buyers are quite often there as well. We've got charges over all of the sites, again, which gives us the security in a similar way to a bank with your mortgage. In terms of the comments around, say, Icelandic banks, it is nothing like that where there was no equity behind it. And again, we actually moved the council out of some of those type of funds several years ago now, on the basis that not only wasn't it not earning, but it was beginning to look like we could lose capital as well. So again, having been stung through that route, and again, coming back on your comment there, Chair, chasing that extra % is not what we've done. We have balanced that out with a reasonable level of interest, which reflects the security behind the assets.
Can you just explain, Sean, the procedure that you would take and your team would take before committing the council to an investment, so the public tonight, as they're joining us, they can actually understand that, Sean?
So throughout any of the investments we've been through, and it obviously depends on the nature as to who we would use, we have brought in specific experts, consultants in their field to actually be able to comment and do due diligence on these assets for us. So, for instance, on some of the solar farm, that was a total mix. We've had some top of the legal advisors looking at the charges over the sites, the security of the sites, and so on. We've had Fitchners in looking at the technical aspects of all of the equipment and so on site. We've had accountants in, obviously, being able to look through and challenge the figures. We've had ACSI in looking at valuations and forecasts and so on as well. So we've gone through that process of due diligence. There was not just me, my team behind me, and some other senior officers within Directors' Board. So we had the Director of Commercial Services going through that as well. Once we were happy, then we would take that through our Chief Executive and be challenged by her as well. And after that, we would then go through to my portfolio holder, the Cabinet, and so on with this, and then through to what we called the Council Spending Review to actually be able to present it through there as well.
And with the income that we get, we realise there are pressures through COVID, and I think very much we touched, and you have mentioned TRL this evening, and also Impulse Leisure. Do we know the exposure we've got on those two?
They're both very different, Chair. In terms of TRL, the scheme that's still running at the moment, which is St Chad's, they're still being rented out. There is no issues with that at all. Any further development is currently on hold, while the Cabinet and wider members will have a review of housing delivery models and so on. So the exposure with the TRL at the moment is minimal because the assets are sitting behind it in terms of the properties on St Chad's site. In terms of Impulse Leisure, that's a very different agreement. The Impulse Leisure lease a number of properties from the council for the provision of leisure facilities. There is no agreement between ourselves and Impulse Leisure in terms of the level of recreation that needs to be provided. Impulse Leisure also operate across Ada as well in terms of other sites, and we know that there are commercial discussions coming forward from Impulse Leisure that will come into the council for possible financial support. So at the moment there is no exposure. There will be a choice.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, obviously we realise that Impulse Leisure was put in originally to manage our leisure facilities, and if my memory serves me correctly, we were spending over £5 million in subsidies at one stage on our leisure facilities, and the Impulse Leisure was a way of actually moving that along and almost levelling that out completely. Obviously, through COVID-19, there has been extreme pressures on all organisations, and with Impulse Leisure shut, there must be huge pressures on them. And obviously, we know that through you and your team, it's in capable hands, and we'd like to thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Johnson.
It's not a question, Chair. I'd just like to commend you for bringing this report here tonight, because the way the discussion's gone, it's quite obvious that this is the correct forum for it, and then for you to go and report it back to full council.
Yes, Councillor Spillman.
Yeah, I think it's a real shame that the way that this has been communicated, perhaps not adequately communicated by the council to the public, and been communicated with a certain level of mischief by third parties, because I think it's important that you've given very clear answers, very clear questions tonight, and I think that adequately to the public so that they can, because if you read that the general discourse on this is Thurrock Council are bankrupt, that's the general, and that's the view out there on the streets of Thurrock, and it's very we're a long way from that. Thurrock Council has borrowed money to invest money and is getting a very good return on it, and that hasn't been adequately explained to the residents of Thurrock, and I think we should make more of an effort to do that, really.
I mean, I think, I note your comments, Councillor Johnson. I think this has been useful because we've actually been told how it operates, etc., which is good. What I would like to see, and I'm sure the committee would agree with me, is a regular report coming to this committee, say on a quarterly basis, so that, these are papers that are available to the public, so the public can understand what we are doing. And then I think that whatever's appeared in the paper will go away, and I think that would be sensible. But we do have a recommendation here to note the report, and do we agree that this comes back once a quarter?
You're fine with me, Chair.
Right, okay. Right, thank you very much. We move on to item 11, which is the A13 Widening Project. We have, are you presenting this, Sean, or is Andy Millard? Andy Millard. Okay. Yes.
Good evening, Chair members. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, just a quickie. I can't hear anything.
Covered, Sean, is it? You couldn't cover this.
Chair members, can you hear me? I can see Councillor Johnson with a thumb, so thank you. Apologies, having sat through the last couple of items, my Wi-Fi decided to drop out right at the very initial moment of this report, so I do apologise for that. So, Chair, this report is provided at your request in order to inform members on the A13 overspend, the completion date and budget implications for Thurrock Council in the current and subsequent financial years. By way of introduction and background, the project involves widening the A13 Stamford-le-Hope bypass from 2 to 3 lanes in both directions, from the junction with the A128 Orsett Cot roundabout in the west to the A1014 Manaway in the east, and replacing 4 bridges as part and parcel of that project. Once it's complete, the project will give a continuous 3-lane carriageway from the M25 to Stamford-le-Hope, reducing congestion and resultant pollution, improving journey times and supporting further economic growth, not just in Thurrock, but across wider South Essex. It's important to stress that there are a number of complicating factors to the delays and costs associated with the A13, and that there is no single issue which has caused the delay in the programme. Rather, it's a combination of issues which have had impacts on the delay and also on the increasing costs. In that regard, there have been 3 significant issues that can be identified as impacting on the scheme. 2 of those issues relate to the design of the drainage and the 4 bridge structures. The 3rd issue relates to the diversion of the utility apparatus. As a result, the delay and cost overrun on the project originate from 3 principal factors. First, a delay in commencement of construction, which is an employer's risk. Secondly, the late delivery and completed design and changes to the works information. And thirdly, a need to tender on the preliminary design and the subsequent separate design and build contracts that resulted. Turning to the specific issues in question, firstly, programme. As a consequence of a programme review, it is now anticipated that the road will be open to traffic in the autumn-winter of 2021. It's important to stress at this point that this does not take into account any delays resulting from the COVID-19 impact, and we are currently very much still assessing what those impacts might be, together with anything else that might arise along the line. Secondly, in terms of the current outturn forecast, this is summarised in paragraph 3.4 of the report, and the table there sets out the anticipated outturn at just north of £114 million. Again, it's important to stress that the Council has recently undertaken a value for money exercise on this project, and it's identified that this reveals that on the current outturn forecast, the scheme still does represent high value for money. And the significance of this means that the additional unring-fence grant that was made available to the DFT to SELEP of just south of £9 million is available to us. And as an update to paragraph 3.7 of the report, the Accountability Board met on the 3rd of July and agreed to the release of those funds. Finally, Chair, the third point that you asked for us to cover was the budget implications. In paragraph 3.9 of the report, we set out that the proposed options available to bridge the forecast funding gap are currently being explored and at this stage have not been confirmed, but it's likely that there will be a combination of funding sources required to meet the gap. Those are bulleted in paragraph 3.9, and in summary, a potential increase in grant funding towards the delivery of the project, a potential for funding contributions from the private sector, and potential for funding contributions from the council itself. Chair, that summarises the report and covers the issues that you wanted to be raised. You'll see from the screen that Anna Eastgate, who's the Assistant Director currently responsible for the project, is here this evening. Sean is in the chamber, and clearly I'm here as well to field any questions as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. So, are there some questions for Andrew and his team? Councillor Spillman.
Yes, a question to. It's probably best to direct this at Anna, actually. So, in hindsight, if and you were, solely in charge of delivering a scheme like this, if someone had brought a proposal to you that an authority the size of Thurrock should take on a project like this, would you be in favour of going ahead?
Yes, can everybody hear me?
So too big for Thurrock, it's something we should steer clear of. I know you've got a lot of experience in terms of these sorts of projects. It's too, we just have to make the best of it now, and hopefully there'll be a lot of benefits to everybody. But in hindsight, should we have steered clear of this one?
Councillor Spillman, Chair. No, I don't think we should have stayed clear of it, actually. I think as an authority of our size, we are capable of delivering projects on this scale, and actually with the ambition of the borough, we need to make sure we are. I think there are elements about various factors actually that influence decision making at the time. I think certain requirements that are driven by funding deadlines and milestones often drive the wrong behaviours and decision making. And I know this is a conversation that we've had with directors about what we need to look at in the future for making commitments in the future to big, large-scale projects, about how we phase that funding. I don't think that this project was too big for us at all. I just think that there was a set of circumstances, along with adapting existing infrastructure, which is always higher risk than building a project on a greenfield site. I think it was a combination of factors that actually contributed to the issues that we face. And I have every confidence, having been involved in the project for the last 10 months now, that we have understood fully the challenges and the risks that we are dealing with, and we are fully and appropriately mitigating them as much as possible. And it's important to note that a lot of our neighbouring authorities during COVID-19 actually made a decision to close down their sites. We didn't do that. We maintained the delivery of this site to mitigate the impacts on cost and programme again. And I have to take my hat off to our contractors for working incredibly difficult circumstances to achieve that. And it's to everybody's credit that we have. And that is going to mean a much reduced impact on programme and project costs as a consequence, once we can fully assess those impacts.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Kent, did you have a question?
Yes, please, Chair. Two questions, really. Firstly, the overspend is large, being a bit blunt about it. What are we putting in place, and what lessons are we learning to ensure as much as possible that we don't end up with a scenario like this again, and that I know you can't say it will never happen again, but what things are we putting in place to try and ensure as much as possible that we won't end up with a project overspending on this sort of scale. And also, the other thing that, as I think the public are aware of, is that there was a lot of, it took a long time for the amount of this overspend to come out into the public domain. It was like people didn't want to acknowledge there was an issue. And I think we need to make sure that, you know, if we have an issue like this and it's overspent, why can't we be more honest and say, yes, it has, and these are the reasons for it? And then, you know, the public are not silly. We can then tell them what the problems were, what we are going to do to hopefully mitigate that, so that things like that won't happen in the future. And is there anything we could have done with hindsight with regarding the contracts, so that the council wasn't having to pick up the bill, if that makes, with regards the scale of what's gone wrong? Was there anything else we could have done in the contract to stop the council and Thurrock council tax residents having to pay for the overspill on this?
Chair, if I could just come in to begin with, and I'll ask Anna to come in a couple of matters of detail, because part of my response here actually cuts into what Councillor Spillman said as well, and to reiterate what Anna said about the council needing to have the ambition and wherefore all to be able to deliver projects of this nature, bearing in mind the prizes that result. And if you look at the A13 alone, and as I said in summary and introduction, you know, there are some considerable benefits to the borough in terms of a reduction in pollution through the reduction in congestion and economic growth that's still off the back of it. So we absolutely do have to get those projects right. That then leads into Councillor Kent's question about the learning, and absolutely we do need to learn from some of the issues that have come out of this particular project. We've done some quite intensive work picking up on some of those things, and Anna's led on those, and I'll let her speak about those exercises in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the point is well made. Yeah, we must move forward, and we must take learning from this project to make sure that we can try and avoid some of these issues happening again in the future.
Chair, Councillor Kent, I'll take the question. I've made a note of all your questions, so I'll run through them systematically, if that's okay. So in terms of the lessons learned, absolutely yes. We have run detailed sessions with a number of officers across different departments in the council that are responsible for delivering any project, not just big projects, but any project. And we have done some detailed interactive sessions with them, and we can quite happily to roll those out again to other officers as and when the need arises. That's not an issue. We have been having conversations with the team that are delivering the civic offices. So again, they're just about to, or have recently, signed the contracts with the contractor for those works. We shared information and knowledge about the challenges and the issues working with particular contractors, talking about the behaviours and how to combat behaviours between various parties on those in those arrangements. And certainly a note has been produced to identify how all of those concerns are being addressed going forward. So in terms of lessons learned, I'm really confident, and all of the work that we've been doing in that space has been very positively received by everybody. It has genuinely been a case that everybody wanted to understand and avoid the issues in the future. So that's been a positive experience. In terms of having a plan in place relating to the costs and the overspend, and given the scale in particular, which is something that you mentioned, Councillor Kent, we are having sessions, roundtable sessions with various team members across different departments to come up with options and ideas to explore in relation to the three criteria that are set out in the report. I can't remember which paragraph they're at now. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. But in relation to those three strands of council funds, private sector funds, or additional grant funding, we're having lots of brainstorming sessions to come up with an action plan about how we can do that. And try and meet the deficit from a variety of funding sources. So yes, that is a work in progress very much currently, and will be overseen by both Andy and Sean, I'm sure. The second point you raised was about it took a long time for this information to come out. Well, having taken over quite a detailed project that had been in train for some 5 years by the time I got involved, there was a lot of information to look into and a lot of background to explore, to understand a lot of how behaviours and decisions had resulted in the situation that we were in. That exercise was complete. And you're right to say that it did take a bit of time to come out in the public domain. The concern we had as officers about that, though, was that we didn't want to come to the public with a half-baked or incomplete exercise, because we wanted to be clear about where we were going to be with programme and absolutely certain about where we were going to be with the forecast outturn, simply because we didn't want to come to the public and say, there's a £10 million overspend, and then 6 months later, oh, well, there's another £10 million overspend, and a few months later, something else happens, and there's another £5 million overspend. We wanted to make sure we were up to speed and fully au fait with every single issue. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, prior to COVID-19 hitting us, I was absolutely confident that the revised forecast outturn that we had arrived at was something that we could pretty much guarantee we could meet. We weren't expecting any additional issues or curveballs to arise. Unfortunately, COVID-19 does alter things slightly, and as we've identified, we don't know the extent of that as yet. The other element was in relation to programme, and again, we could have drip-fed the public about the programme. It's going to be complete in 3 months' time, 6 months' time. Again, we wanted to be certain that we could come out with a date that we could stick to. And I think about a year ago, the government issued lessons learned on major projects, and we're all, familiar with Crossrail and the HS2s of this world and the challenges that government has on delivering big projects in the same way that we're having challenges delivering our big projects. And one of the key recommendations from that piece of work was come out with a range in figures. Don't pin your colours to a mast on a single figure, and come out with a range on your completion date. That way you can manage everybody's expectations appropriately. And so that is learning that we have taken and we are trying to apply on this project. And so, yes, it is unfortunate it took a little bit of time, but it was more important that we were going to the public with genuine answers about what we genuinely believed was the position. And that was where we got to. And then the third element of your question was about the contracts and is there anything that we could have done differently? I think with the benefit of hindsight, there's always things that we could have done differently. And I think a lot of the problems come back to the decisions being driven by government funding deadlines. So, we get growth fund deals, we have deadlines on when we've got to spend the money. And unfortunately, it is a reality that those deadlines drive less than optimum decisions at times. And I think in this instance, the timescales led to us having to use a framework for the contracts as opposed to being able to develop and go to market with our own bespoke design and build contracts. And I think that decision, which was entirely driven by the need to secure that funding, was a less than optimum decision. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, we would perhaps do things differently. And actually on the Stamford Le Hope scheme, which is the next item on the agenda, we are hoping to do something differently in that space. We can because a lot of the government funding that's been given on that scheme has been spent. So we're not under the same restrictions in terms of time. We're able to take our time to develop the design in detail so that we can go to market with a complete design and procure it on a fixed price contract. And there are generally only two ways to go on big projects. One is a design and build contract with early contractor involvement at the beginning, where you develop your preliminary design, your tender is tendered on that preliminary design. Therefore, there is a huge amount of risk that the employer has to carry, which was the situation on the A13. The opposite end of the spectrum is that you take longer to go to market, you take longer to develop your scheme, but you go to market with the detail that means that you can negotiate a fixed price tender, and that means the risk that you carry on the project is much reduced. And so these are all the sorts of lessons that we are learning, the information that we're sharing in the council with officers, and it is definitely stuff that we need to apply in the future.
Councillor Spillman.
I mean, first, someone who's lived, in various places up and down the A13 over the last few years. The A13, the problems in traffic with the A13 are not just Thurrock. They are, there's Sadler's Farm, there's further down in Hadley. I just think that when we're dealing with the A13, why have we not got a wider strategic body in place with all the councils from South Essex to deal with the problem of the A13 in its entirety, rather than just dealing with just this stretch on our own? And the other point I'd like to make is so many people benefit from this scheme outside of Thurrock. So are you absolutely satisfied that we got the level of support from central funds that we should have, considering the benefits that so many other people from so many other boroughs are going to get from this scheme?
Chair, if I could just pick that one up initially, if I may, and I think Councillor Spillman's point is well made, and the need to look at how infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure, but I would suggest health and other forms of infrastructure too, is provided more effectively on a sub-regional basis as opposed to a local basis, where it has those broader sub-regional benefits and impacts, is something that needs to be looked at going forward. We are where we are with this particular project, but I do think that point around strategic infrastructure is well made. The second question really relates off the back of that, and that's how those sorts of schemes are provided where there is that sub-regional funding requirements. But yeah, as I say, I think that's something bigger than this project and bigger than this item this evening. But it's something that definitely needs to look at as South Essex looks to collectively grow and develop going forward.
Is it true that I'm echoing. There we go. Is it true that the mapping that we received from Essex County Council, in particular in relation to some of the utilities and how the road was planned, has also been a major problem and resulted in significant extra costs?
Chair, Councillor Spillman, it's correct that some of the as-built drawings were not reflective of what was actually on the ground. It's also quite common, having worked for a large utility company, it's also quite common actually for utility companies not to precisely understand where all of their assets and equipment is in the ground, and certainly that was an issue that we encountered. I'm not entirely convinced that was all of Essex County Council's fault. I think some of the issues also related to ground investigation works that were undertaken as part of the preliminary design, and there was some errors and issues and concerns about that preliminary investigation work that was done, which then triggered a requirement to do further ground investigation work, and then we ended up with a situation where we had two very differing reports on from two different sources on the ground investigations, and so there were issues in how we could rationalise both of those reports and the differences between them. So again, there was a combination of factors that contributed to the perfect storm, if you like. It was not one single issue, but certainly we've had quite a lot of significant rework to do on the design for the structures, particularly Orsett-Cock Junction being the main largest junction that we were modifying, and it was that modification work that cost a significant amount of money and caused a fair amount of delay as well.
Sean, we obviously are where we are. We've got an overspend. It's been reported it's 41 million. Now, how are we actually going to cope with that? Are we going to have to borrow some more money to cushion that? Because I can't see that we're suddenly going to rip out 41 million from our budget perhaps you could explain to the members of the committee here, and more importantly, the residents of Thurrock, because that's why I asked for the report.
Thank you, Chair. And as you can imagine, it was one of the key questions on Monday night at PTR as well. I think the first thing to say is that we have to recognise that we have a contract, and so we will be legally obliged to pay. Although there is a great deal more significant work in challenging the contractors now in being able to reduce down those costs and certainly avoid any further escalation where we can. Para 3.9 though shows that we've only really got three, they're very high level, three different routes to us, which is an increase in grant funding towards the delivery of the project. So we will actively seek any further opportunities of grants that come through. The report clearly states as well that we've just received another £9 million from CELEP on that basis, and we will continue to see if there is anything else, and from other grant distributors. We will look at our partners in the private sector, and that will also include looking at some of the organisations that have provided advice and so on as well, if that has been seen to be faulty. But ultimately, if we can't close the gap completely through contributions from either grants or funding contributions, which also includes Section 106s, by the way, then Thurrock Council will have to meet it from capital resources. The first part of the capital resources would certainly have to be capital receipts and trying to max the approach through there. But ultimately, if we needed to move into prudential borrowing, we would have to, but that's an absolute last resort.
Chair, if I could just...
Would we be able to get any money from the Department of Transport?
That's the first bullet point, Chair. In terms of grant, we will look towards the Department of Transport as well as any other department in the government. Obviously, the stimulus package that's now beginning to come out through government is looking for more and more capital projects as well. So anything we will be looking through to try and minimise that gap.
Chair, if I could just come in.
Any further
please.
Questions?
Chair, excuse me.
Okay, the report is duly noted.
We need to correct the figure.
And I think even on this,
I had a question.
Should come back, members, on a quarterly basis, so that we're kept up. Sorry.
Chair, Councillor Rice, can you hear me?
I did have a small question as well.
Well, carry on, Councillor Potter.
Yeah, it's just a quick one, really.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, on page 143, paragraph 3.2, it says it is anticipated that productivity could return to approximately 90% in the near future. Can you tell us what is the productivity percentage rate at the current time? Thank you.
Chair, I can answer that question if everybody can hear me. So at the moment, we're operating at about 85% on the project. We have a move to bring more of the contractor team back on site in the next 2 weeks. We've been putting in measures to protect the workforce from COVID-19. Those measures are all in place now. And so we very much anticipate that within the next couple of weeks, we'll be back up at 90, even potentially 95% of activity on site. If I could just, that answers your question, hopefully, Councillor Potter. But Chair, just in relation to the mention of 41 million, I think I just need to correct that for the record. I know it was reported in the press as 41 million. To my knowledge, and I'm receiving the financial reports on a fairly regular basis, the forecast outturn isn't at 41 million at the current time. The actual shortfall was 35 million that we needed, not a 41 million pound overspend. So I think we need to be really accurate and careful about how we report figures, because we need to make sure that there's accurate information for all the reasons we've been discussing this evening that are out in the public domain.
No, that's fine, and we like to see that so members of the public can actually see what is actually happening, which is quite correct. So with that, no further questions. We'll note that report, and we move on to our last item, which is the Stamford Hope transport projects. Sean, you're going to introduce Andy.
Chair, thank you.
Introduce this item, please.
Yes, I will, and I can be quite brief in introducing this one. So, Chair, the report is provided at your request in order to inform members of the specific matters relating to the Stamford Hope Transport Hub. 2 points that you wanted covering in particular. Firstly, the £7 million spend on consultants and how that spend on consultants was financed and what it achieved and who authorised this. And the second point, the price for the old brewery to accommodate the parking and waiting area for buses and coaches going into DP World. By way of introduction and background, this scheme involves construction of a new station building with footbridge and lifts, passenger information systems, bus turnaround facility, passenger drop-off points and cycle parking. In September 2019, the project underwent a pause and review to understand the key challenges and to look at the options for bringing the project forward. This included an opportunity to acquire some additional land to bring the project forward in a way which removed a lot of the risk and provided alternatives to deliver a much improved scheme, including public realm area in front of the station, a dedicated bus drop-off, bus turnaround facilities, transport hub and parking on the former brewery site that is situated opposite the station land. Turning to the specific issues in question, of which there are two. Firstly, the project spend, funding sources, outcomes and governance. In terms of the spend and funding sources, they're summarised in the table in paragraph 3.1 of the report. Of this budget, the costs incurred to date amount to 10.3 million or thereabouts. Those costs include the acquisition of the old brewery site, contract costs and professional fees. With regard to governance, the Cabinet reports set out in sections 2.3 and 2.4 of this report delegate the authority to the former position of Head of Transport and Highways. This post has now been removed from the Council structure but has been incorporated within the Police Directorate. On the second point, in relation to the old brewery site, the land was acquired by negotiation in May 2020 at a cost of just over £3 million. A Cabinet report of the 15th of January 2020 delegated authority for the acquisition of the land to the Corporate Director of Finance, Governance and Property and the Director of Place in consultation with the portfolio holder for regeneration. Chair, as with the previous report, happy to field any questions between us. Please let us know if you've got any questions or queries. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes, Andy. The question I'd like to ask is, do we have an overall figure of how much we've actually expended on consultants through this period?
I want to answer that. Councillor Rice, we don't have an overall figure on what we've spent on consultants in the overall period. We've got an overall figure on what we've spent on the project to date, which includes project management resource, but also is the original design and build ECI contract that we procured way back at the beginning with Morgan Sindall. So we've got a budget figure for that, which is around the £7 million mark. We've spent, as the report alludes to, we've spent approximately £10 million of the budget when you factor in the land acquisition that we've recently acquired.
And so I suppose the final question would be, when do you anticipate this project to be complete?
So, Councillor Rice, at the moment we're in detailed design. So we've just brought on board our detailed designers. We've divided the project into phase 1 and phase 2. That was because we recognised the fact that residents in Stamford have put up with a temporary station building for over a year now. and we need to bring forward the much improved facilities that we hope to deliver as part of this scheme. So the aim is that we will go to market to tender on a fixed price tender for phase 1 initially, and that work, it's very much expected, will be complete because the station building is a modular structure. So, and we're making use of a lot of the existing infrastructure on the site. So we anticipate that element, phase 1, will be complete by summer 2021. In parallel, once we've got phase 1 up and running and moving in the right direction at a faster pace, we will then bring forward phase 2 in parallel. So we will start working on the design. We will be using the car park site or the brewery site as our construction compound. So very much once phase 1 is complete, we will then move, hopefully, subject to planning permission being achieved, we will then move swiftly on to construction for the phase 2 works. At the moment, I don't have a final completion date for the phase 2 works because we haven't developed the design sufficiently to understand what the programme for that will be. But generally speaking, it's general civil works, so it should be able to be complete in a relatively short period of time.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. Are there any further? Yes, Councillor Spillman.
I think one of the main reasons that I'm never going to put myself on planning, transport and regen is my utter frustration at how long even the seemingly most easy projects take to build in this country compared to other countries. My head would just explode if I sat on there for too long. But in terms of, I think that what frustrates, and again, it's a story that gets the council a really bad name. I think one of the things that, you know, if you're, I mean, very recently, I've just moved from Stamford out, so I lived in Stamford for not a great amount of time, but some time. One of the main things down there is King's Carpark, the King Street car park, and so we've bought this land for 3.5. Is it 3.5 million? That we've bought the land.
3.1, just short.
And yet, you know, Joe Public down in Stamford sees that. I mean, how much? Can you just clarify? Because I was always under the understanding that we sold King Street car park for basically nothing. And people, you know, a similar sized bit of land in a very local, in the same locality, and it just drives people, taxpayers, nuts. You know how this goes on, and I think one of the main issues is that there's a feeling that, I mean, I'm accountable as a councillor, although not this year, it's just COVID. But there's a sort of understanding that these decisions that no one within council, in terms of departments or officers, is accountable for these problems. And I think one of the other concerns that I've got as a councillor is that we've seen recently that if you criticise some of the decisions that are being made in these projects publicly, you end up with a charge on a member's code of conduct. And it's just, you know, it is, I think we've got into a situation where people really don't see the proper accountability for these ongoing issues that we've had. Now, I mean, I think the council should really, I think there's, you know, the people of Stamford are due an apology regarding this project. And I know that great efforts have been made to make sure this is being turned around. But can you, I mean, you gave some quite, I mean, apart from COVID, you gave some quite bullish assurances regarding the A13. You know, can you give the long-suffering people of Stamford-le-Hope with their awful station the same, you know, bullish response that this is finally going to get sorted out?
Councillor Spillman, I think I can speak with confidence on this project. Actually, in the absence of acquiring the brewery site, I have doubts about how deliverable the scheme was, to be quite frank. And I think that the acquisition of the brewery site has given this project a whole new opportunity to deliver something substantially better than what was originally proposed. I had concerns about the safety with the bus turnaround facility in the centre, in the station forecourt. We were using Mucking Creek and building out over the creek. That was driving the need to rebuild and replace the London Road Bridge. There were concerns and issues over land rights. There were concerns and issues over the Environment Agency and flooding, and particularly the residents of Chancery Crescent that were incredibly concerned. There was issues about moving Network Rail infrastructure that was going to cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. You know, the revision to the scheme has meant that we can save a lot of those costs. Yes, we've had to spend money to acquire the site, but the difference between the £19 million budget and the original design was another £7 million of funding that needed to be provided. So this revision has given us an opportunity to spend some money on an asset that the council owns, deliver much improved local parking, deliver improved public realm outside of the station, and actually save a lot of issues with key stakeholders, flood risk, all the consents that would have needed to have gone along with that. So it is very much an improved scheme. And one of the additional elements that we've taken in the last couple of months, we have project steering groups with key stakeholders on them. Normally, people who have got a financial interest, so they've contributed funding to the scheme, and the officer group and the contractors. On Stamford Le Hope, I've taken a different approach. And actually, I've invited the ward members onto the steering group, so they attend, along with those other key stakeholders. And we've also got resident representation on that as well, because it's very much the view that they have lots of local knowledge, a valuable contribution to play in helping us shape those proposals. And it's much better to have them on board with us, involved in some of those decision making, rather than on the outside wondering what's going on. And I think I do speak, I don't need to speak on behalf of anybody, but it's been communicated to us by Councillor Hebb and Councillor Piccolo that they see this as very much a positive step and have every confidence in the project team that we can bring this project forward. So I very much do hope that we can deliver something valuable and much improved as quickly as possible and on budget for that local community.
Well, certainly the project is welcomed. It is needed, because we all know that DP World will expand and will create tens of thousands of new jobs. So we need this infrastructure. But unlike other countries like Germany, France, Japan, and dare we say China, they seem to build things quicker. I think that's what the members are saying, Anna. That's not your fault. It's not Andy's fault. It's a process within our country. But that is something we will overcome. But I think also with this particular report, I think the members would agree that, again, this should come back to us on a quarterly basis so that we can keep an eye on it. And of course, the main thing is that members of the public have access to this. So, it's open and transparent. And I think that's very important. And would you agree with that it comes back on a quarterly basis? Right. Yes, of course, Councillor Spillman.
Again, like the A13, you've both given, really detailed, direct answers about what needed to be done differently, just like the investment as well. And I just think it would be of great value for as many people in Stamford Le Hope to see these answers as possible, because it really does, it would be a real benefit to as many people as possible, and ease so many frustrations for them to get such direct answers and in such detail.
Well, I'm sure Anna and Andy can arrange for a general circular letter to go to residents of Stamford so that they are aware of what the council are doing. Would that be possible?
Councillor Rice, we are in the process of setting up an online registrable newsletter So residents, and it will be signposted in the station building and in that vicinity for people to sign up to receive updates on the project. We're in the process of reviewing the major projects websites on the council's website to try and improve the level of information that we're providing and making it much more accessible to the community. A couple of the communities that are most affected have got these resident reps on the steering group, as I've mentioned, Chantry Crescent, and I can't remember the name of the other road, it escapes me. So we have got resident reps that are on the steering group for the purposes of helping to disseminate that information. So I would hope that would address concerns about communication. It is something that we are very acutely aware that we need to address, and it is certainly something that Councillor Hebb has raised with us directly as a project team as well.
Good. I think the use of the internet will be very handy, Anna.
Yeah.
And well done.
Thank you.
So we move to our final item on our agenda this evening, and that report is noted duly, and that's agreed. Thank you. Which is the work programme. We've included these 3 items, which we've discussed this evening, onto our quarterly business. Is there anything else that anyone wishes to add onto the business? So everyone's content, and just these 3 items, Lucy, on a regular basis, and I think that will go a long way for open governance. And thank you very much for your attendance. And yes.
Can I just say that? I mean, I'm not sat on as many committees as the chair, obviously, but I've sat on enough committees, and I do think that tonight more important information has come out of very important information of great public interest has come out of this committee than almost all of the other ones that I've sat on combined. So it has been very valuable. So well done, Chair.
I think this is the function of this committee, and we're filling it, and we're giving the public information that they require, which is very important. Well, I would like to obviously thank Sean and his team for all the background information, and obviously Anna and Andy Millard, and obviously our auditors. Very good reports. And thank you very much for your attendance this evening.